Hey everyone, big news breaking out of Washington and Abu Dhabi today. And honestly, it's the kind of story that has everyone from DC to Kiev to Moscow on the edge of their seats. So let's break down what's really happening with this Ukraine peace deal that President Trump is pushing so hard for. Ukraine just agreed to a peace proposal, folks. A U.S. official told CBS News that Kiev has signed on, with only what they're calling minor details left to sort out. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Ukraine's National Security Advisor Rustem Umerov is saying President Zelensky could actually fly to the United States before the end of November to finalize everything. That's right, we're talking days, not weeks or months. Trump himself took to Truth Social, saying there are only a few remaining points of disagreement, which sounds optimistic until you realize Russia hasn't said a word yet about whether they're actually on board with any of this. And that's kind of the elephant in the room, isn't it? So what's been happening behind the scenes? Well, U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll has been in Abu Dhabi, meeting with Russian officials. Multiple sources confirmed he's been going in and out of meetings all day Tuesday, basically doing diplomatic heavy lifting that nobody really saw coming from a 38-year-old Army guy with zero diplomatic experience. But Trump calls him the drone guy and apparently trusts him, so here we are. The thing is, while all this diplomatic activity is happening in the UAE, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is playing it pretty cool. He's basically saying Russia appreciates America's effort, but they're waiting to see if this updated proposal actually matches what Putin and Trump supposedly agreed on back in August during their Alaska meeting. And this is crucial. Lavrov made it crystal clear that if the new plan doesn't reflect those Anchorage understandings, then, quote, it will be a different situation in principle. Russia could walk away from the whole thing if they don't like what they're hearing. Now let's talk about what's actually in this deal, or at least what we know about it. The original 28-point proposal that leaked last week was pretty controversial. It basically asked Ukraine to give up its entire Donetsk region, including parts Russia hasn't even conquered yet, and abandon its dreams of joining NATO. For a lot of people, especially in Europe and Ukraine itself, that sounded way too much like surrender. But after talks in Geneva over the weekend with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, and diplomat from Europe and Ukraine, apparently they revised it down to 19 points. The White House is saying Ukraine's major concerns about security guarantees got thoroughly addressed, which is huge because that's been Zelensky's red line from day one. He needs guarantees that Russia won't just invade again in 5 years. According to Ukraine's ambassador to the U.S., those security assurances are supposed to be similar to NATO's Article 5, meaning if Russia attacks again, America and allies would step in. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. Ukrainian sources with direct knowledge of the talks told CNN that while progress is being made, there are still at least 3 crucial sticking points. First, whether Ukraine has to surrender territory Russia annexed but hasn't conquered. Second, limiting Ukraine's army to 600,000 troops, which Ukraine wants to negotiate further. And third, that whole NATO membership thing, which Ukrainian sources are calling completely unacceptable because it would basically give Russia veto power over NATO decisions. Meanwhile, what's happening on the ground? Because diplomacy is one thing, but the war is still very much happening. Tuesday night, Russia launched another massive drone attack on Kyiv, killing at least 7 people and injuring 13 others, including a child. Energy infrastructure got hammered again. Moldova reported 6 drones crossed into their airspace. NATO had to scramble fighter jets because at least 1 Russian drone violated Romanian airspace. So while everyone's talking peace in conference rooms, regular Ukrainians are still dealing with very real danger every single night. President Zelensky made a point to remind everyone that the war hasn't actually ended yet, and Ukraine still desperately needs defense support from its partners. French President Macron also pointed this out, saying Russia is pretending it wants peace while continuing to strike civilian infrastructure. And that's the reality check here. Russia is still fighting aggressively while negotiating, which tells you something about their strategy. European leaders are taking this pretty seriously, though. The Coalition of the Willing, which is basically Ukraine's key allies, met virtually on Tuesday. For the first time ever, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio joined the call, which signals America's commitment to staying involved. Macron announced that European security guarantees for Ukraine would involve British, French, and even Turkish troops providing what he called a reassurance force after any ceasefire. The idea is these troops would deploy away from front lines, but show Russia that invading again would mean tangling with NATO powers. Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer said Zelensky is indicating he could accept the majority of the text, but stressed that robust security guarantees are essential. Germany's participating too. Everyone's basically saying the same thing. Ukraine's borders cannot be changed by force, and any solution must fully involve Ukraine and preserve its sovereignty. But here's what I find fascinating about Trump's approach to all of this. He originally set a Thanksgiving deadline, then walked that back, and now he's saying, you know what the deadline for me is? When it's over. Classic Trump move, right? Creating urgency, putting public pressure on both sides, then giving himself flexibility. His administration is clearly trying to use momentum to force Putin and Zelensky to the table. The optimistic rhetoric from the White House this week, according to sources, is by design. They want to make it harder for either side to walk away by publicly raising the stakes. Trump told reporters on Air Force One that his envoy Steve Witkoff will be going to Moscow next week to meet Putin. And get this, Trump said his son-in-law Jared Kushner might go with him. At the same time, Dan Driscoll will meet with Ukrainians again. Trump says he hopes to meet with both Putin and Zelensky after that, but only when the deal is basically final. Now, is this all going to work? That's the million-dollar question everybody's asking. Former CIA Director Leon Panetta told CNN that Ukraine should probably indicate it's not seeking NATO membership right now and focus instead on joining the European Union, which he thinks makes more sense. Former NATO Commander Admiral James Stavridis agreed, saying NATO membership will come eventually, but Ukraine should prioritize EU membership first. The challenge is that Ukraine giving up NATO aspirations has been a Russian demand from the very beginning of this war, so that's not easy for Zelensky to swallow politically. What we do know is that Putin seems to believe he'll get Donetsk one way or another, either through negotiation or by just taking on the battlefield. And honestly, Russian forces have been making steady progress toward Pokrovsk, which is a major logistics hub. U.S. officials wouldn't directly say Ukraine is losing in the east, but they admit the trajectory isn't great for Kyiv's defensive prospects. So what does all this leave us? Ukraine has apparently agreed to a framework. European allies are preparing security guarantees. Trump is pushing hard for a landmark agreement. But Russia, the actual invading force here, hasn't confirmed they're on board with anything yet. Lavrov's comments suggest Moscow wants to see if the revised plan matches what they think they already got Trump to agree to months ago. If it doesn't, they could reject the whole thing. And even if Russia does agree on paper, there's zero guarantee they'll actually follow through. I mean, this is the same government that promised to respect Ukraine's borders in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum and then invaded in 2014 and again in 2022. Trust is not exactly abundant here. What makes this different is Trump's personal involvement and his relationship with Putin. He clearly wants this win, wants to be the president who ended the Ukraine war. But that desire for a deal also creates risks. The worry among Ukraine and European allies is that Trump might push Zelensky to accept terms that essentially reward Russian aggression just to get an agreement signed. The next few days are going to be absolutely crucial. If Zelensky really does fly to the U.S. before December, we'll know negotiations are serious. If Witkoff and possibly Kushner go to Moscow and come back with Russian buy-in, that's huge. But if Putin rejects the revised terms or demands we go back to that original 28-point plan that looked so favorable to Russia, then we're probably back to square one. And meanwhile, the war continues. People are dying. Infrastructure is being destroyed. Winter is coming, which historically has been brutal for Ukraine's civilian population when Russia targets their power grid. So yeah, diplomacy is great, talking is better than fighting, but until Russian troops actually leave Ukrainian soil and credible enforcement mechanisms are in place, a lot of folks are going to remain pretty skeptical that any piece of paper is going to end this nightmare. That's where we are right now. Progress, maybe, Hope cautiously. But peace? Well, that's still very much up in the air. Thanks for watching, and I'll keep you updated as this story develops, because, trust me, it's developing fast.